All right, so I will turn it over to Kalina at USF.
Hi, everyone. Like Nicole said, my name's Kalina Chittick, and I work for University of San Francisco. I am here today to talk a little bit with all of you on testing in the college admissions process. And just want to, first of all, say I know it's a stressful time. I know that there's a lot happening in the world, and especially testing and a lot of changes in college admission is happening right as we speak. So definitely know that this is an important topic, and hopefully can help answer some questions you all have about kind of how testing plays into the college admissions process. And we'll definitely have some time for questions and answers as we move along at the end. I've been at USF for about 3 years now. I was a regional in Southern California based in San Diego, but as Nicole mentioned, recently moved up to Pacific Northwest to be the regional for USF for Oregon, Washington, Colorado area. So we will have a new SoCal regional for you all to work with. But definitely very familiar with High Tech High and your structure. Worked with a lot of students in the past, both at USF and my previous role at Oregon State University as a regional admission counselor in SoCal as well. And so, yeah, I'm here today to just tell you a little bit about, my experience in higher ed and the testing process and kind of how it plays into admissions decisions, and how you can kind of prepare yourself for all of this process as well. So to kind of let you know what we'll be talking about today. Can you all see my screen? It's good to go there? Okay, great. Sorry there. Okay. So first of all, I just want to go over a few of the talking points that I'll touch on today during our conversation. First, just want to go over a little bit of the kind of overview of testing and college admissions and kind of the role it plays, and especially kind of historically. Talk a little bit about some different options for as you apply to schools. There's different types of schools as far as their admissions process and what testing they utilize. So there's schools that use test optional, test flexible, and then schools that require tests. So I'm going to go through each of those three different kind of options and talk a little bit about what they look like, how to figure out which schools require what, and how to best prepare yourself for that as well. And then we'll definitely leave some time, like I said, for questions. So just want to go, a quick overview. I know we might have students from multiple different grades here that might not know as much about, testing in college admissions. So first of all, I just want to highlight the two main tests that are used in the college admissions process. Traditionally, it's the SAT and ACT. The SAT is the Scholastic Aptitude Test, and ACT is American College Testing. So those are often the top two that are referred to in college admission. And just a little history, I thought it would just be interesting to talk about kind of where this all started and how it's played in the college admission process for a long time. In 1901 was actually when the kind of first college entrance exam was took place, and it was 12 presidents from some prestigious universities in the New England area that kind of came together and decided they wanted to standardize the admissions process and to also really drive high schools to have more uniform curriculum in their high school processes. So that was when the first college entrance exam happened. The SAT was developed in 1926, so quite a while ago, but followed by the ACT in 1959. And then I thought it was interesting, the UC system actually started requiring SAT in 1960, so not too long ago. And then some recent kind of updates that have been really impacting the college admissions world, especially as it relates to testing, is in 2007, we kind of saw some issues with scoring, and some pretty prominent schools decided to go test optional. And this was really the kind of beginning of this wave of test optional processes for schools. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of schools start to switch to test optional processes. And then within the last year, having both the college admission scandal last spring, which included some cheating and bribing from testing kind of agents, and then this spring having COVID-19 hit and not having the ability to do our spring SAT, ACT tests, that has really impacted the whole admissions field, and really thinking about how do we use tests, especially when there's issues of access and disadvantage and different things that are built into some of these tests. So how can we both address these in some of the policies and also with the pandemic happening, how can we shift some of the policies to help, especially the students that will be applying next fall. So just a brief kind of overview of where testing came from. It really originated in wanting to create more uniform in the admissions process, and gives us a standard we can kind of use. But I think as it's developed and gone along, we've really discovered that there's a lot of inequities in some of these tests, issues of access, especially for college prep, how students have access to test prep facilities or resources, can be a huge barrier for students, and it ends up actually sometimes determining, how they end up doing on the exam, how much just prep they've had for it. So all of those issues kind of are built into some of these tests, and really why a lot of schools are now kind of moving away from tests to create more test optional, policies for students. So especially with coronavirus, we've seen a lot, as I mentioned, of schools moving away from tests. Because obviously our juniors, which I'm sure we have some in the audience today, didn't have the option to take those spring, tests for you to prep for this upcoming fall, when you're going through the application process. So most times juniors are taking those tests spring of their junior year to then have the scores ready for when, admission applications open fall of their senior year. So because students weren't able to do that, a lot of schools are postponing, or a lot of schools are basically going test optional for this upcoming year, and some have chose to go test optional for longer than that as well. But you can see there's a few articles here that really talking about kind of the current state of college admission. The biggest news recently was the UC system decided to go to drop the SAT ACT requirement for admission, which is huge. The UC system is really seen as kind of paving the way for a lot of policy work in higher ed. So when they do something, often a lot of other schools follow. Obviously, there's some other articles here talking about, will the coronavirus kind of impact this, maybe killing the admissions tests overall. Maybe, higher ed is totally going to move away from this. So because of this kind of current situation, I think it's causing a lot of schools to really think about how we're using tests, and if they're going to go test optional for, longer than just this upcoming cycle. So just to talk about what test optional even means, I know I've been throwing this word around. Historically, a lot of schools have required either the SAT or ACT for admission. So that means in order to apply, you have to submit the SAT or ACT test scores. With schools going test optional, that means that students really have the choice of whether they want to submit those scores or not. So it means that you as an applicant in the admissions process can either opt in to submit those test scores if you feel like they're a good representation of you and your academic achievements and abilities. You can still submit them. Or if you decide, I feel like there's other factors like my GPA, my extracurriculars, other things about me as an applicant that I feel like are a stronger representation than my test scores, then you can choose to actually not submit the test, SAT or ACT. So it really gives students that choice, that option, and puts it in your hands to decide what you want to show these colleges and universities. So test optional means that you can apply without those test scores, and you can still submit an application and be fully reviewed. Often the first question I get when students hear that we at University of San Francisco are test optional, and often the first question a student asks is, well, will that hurt my application? And I think that that's a common myth that a lot of students have, is that if they go and apply test optional, that somehow these colleges are going to not review their application as seriously, or it's going to be a mark against them. And that's really not the point of test optional policy. The point is to really allow you the choice of what you want to submit and show to your colleges that you're applying to. And we're not going to look at students that are applying test optional different than students that are applying with test scores. Some schools have additional requirements when you apply test optional. So if you opt into applying test optional, sometimes they will require an extra letter of recommendation or a writing sample or something additional in place of those tests. Whereas other schools like USF, we allow students to apply test optional and you don't have to submit anything extra. It just means that then we're going to utilize your other parts of your application, like your high school transcript, strength of curriculum, your letters of rec, we require at least one, extracurriculars, and the college essays. That's really what we're utilizing to review the application, just minus the test scores there. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind is that, you know, when schools say test optional, every school is different, and you're going to have to ask the individual schools what specific policies they have if they do require something in place of those tests. Currently, before COVID hit, there was over 1,000 schools in the US that had now gone test optional. Couldn't find the most up-to-date number because every week I feel like schools, there's more and more going test optional, but wouldn't be surprised if soon we're almost hitting the 2,000 mark. I would definitely anticipate that happening soon. Just with COVID-19, we've really seen a lot of schools choose to go test optional. It was already kind of a trend in higher ed, was moving more towards that. And then because of the spring tests, it just really, I think, caused a lot of schools to think either they're going to go test optional for just this upcoming year, being fall, if you're applying for fall 2021, so any juniors in this call, a lot of schools are going test optional specifically for your group, or some schools have decided to, you know, go test optional further and really say, you know what, we're going to change our whole policy moving forward. And as I mentioned, a lot of times schools are changing these policies not only because of, you know, issues of students having access to these tests, but also these tests have consistently shown through different studies that they actually aren't the best predictor of how students will do in college. And so that's really been something that a lot of schools are asking, if they're not the best predictor of how students will do, why are we putting such an emphasis on them? And I think also on the flip side, you all as students feel a lot of pressure. You're already, you know, being put pressure on to take really strength of curriculum classes. I know AP is not offered at High-Tech High, but to, you know, take as many of the you know, tough classes as you can, to be involved in extracurriculars, and then also to get the best test score you can. So it's just a lot of pressure put on students for something that's not always shown to be such a strong predictor. It's actually more of the performance in high school. Your GPA, the grades that you're getting, is actually a stronger predictor of how students will do in the college atmosphere. So that has also been a really strong motivator for schools to move away from the tests. So just a few things to keep in mind when you're thinking about, you know, test optional schools. I mentioned, you know, that some schools require something additional. So definitely do your research and make sure you're looking to see, hey, does this school require an additional essay or an additional letter of rec? I always recommend to students that are applying to schools, keep a spreadsheet of like the schools you're applying to, the due dates, and what they require. And that's something you can start doing this summer, especially for you juniors in the room, virtual room. You can start creating that spreadsheet now and really listing the dates and what they require if they are test optional on a spreadsheet so that you can track that. And then the other thing about applying to schools that might be test optional, they may be test optional for admission, but not all schools are also test optional for scholarships. So that means sometimes when you're applying to a test optional school, they may not require tests to be considered for admission, but they may require it to be considered for merit scholarships. So that's just something to be aware of, is that some schools still do have a different policy for your merit scholarships than for the admission side of things. So we always recommend students to still take the test because it can be helpful, and you just have them in your back pocket then to maybe apply to a school that's not test optional, or, you know, you may do really well in them and you want to show that to schools. So even with a test optional school, once again, you have the choice to submit those if it's something you're really proud of and feel like that would really add to your overall admissions story that you're creating there. But yeah, there's a lot of schools out there that have gone test optional but still require those tests for scholarships. At USF, we chose not to. We just use your GPA as the kind of measure for our merit scholarship. So traditionally, for students that aren't applying test optional, we use their GPA and test scores. For students that go test optional for merit scholarships, we just are using their GPA to determine the merit, but not every school does that. And then I think with test optional, the hardest thing is to, you know, figure out, how do I know if I should apply test optionals? Okay, so I'm looking at, let's say 10 schools, and out of those 10 schools, 3 of them are test optional. How do I know if I should send those test scores or if I shouldn't? And I think the biggest thing to think about is how are these test scores adding to your academic story? Do these test scores help your academic story? Do they help support the other things that the admission officer is going to see throughout your application? I always encourage students to really think of their application as a whole picture. So how do the test scores fit into the other pieces of your application? If you feel like they do enhance that story and show something about you and your academic abilities, then you definitely want to submit them. On the flip side, some students feel like, you know what, I feel like my overall GPA and transcript is really telling a stronger story about my academic abilities. And in that case, you may want to go the test optional route and not submit your tests. Most schools publish their data on the last year's incoming class on their website or in a brochure or something like that. So you can often ask schools what their last year's average test score was. That's a really good indicator of if you should submit your test scores or not. If you see that average and you're above that average, it's probably a good idea to submit those test scores. If you see the average for the school and you're below that, that's where you may want to think about going that test optional route. And obviously talking with your counselors about choosing to go test optional is always a good piece of advice there, because they can often help you kind of determine which schools might be the best ones to go test optional there. And then on the flip side to test optional, there's also something we call test flexible. I feel like this isn't as common anymore. I think more schools are going into a total test optional policy, but there are still some schools like NYU that is test flexible. So what test flexible means is instead of the traditional SAT or ACT exams that are required, they have more flexibility in the types of exams you can submit. So you could submit like some AP, so advanced placement exams, you could submit IB exams. Some of them allow you to submit the SAT subject tests in lieu of your SAT or ACT traditional test scores. So they're basically allowing more flexibility with the types of tests that students can submit to fulfill that testing requirement. So those test flexible schools still have some sort of testing requirement, but the ways you can fulfill that are a little bit greater than your traditional university that's going to require just the SAT or ACT to fulfill that. So once again, it's really important to do your research on especially test flexible schools, because they're going to have specific outlines of what they do require for that testing requirement here. So I've listed NYU's kind of list of what they require. So for students, they can take either the SAT or ACT. They could do the IB diploma to suffice for that testing. They could do 3 subject test scores, 3 AP exam scores, or 3 IB, so international baccalaureate courses, subject tests, exams they could take to fulfill that. So there's a couple different requirements that you have, and you can fulfill it in one of these ways. So really for test flexible, the biggest thing to do is to do your research. And especially I know High Tech High, you might not be taking AP exams already because you don't offer AP classes. So, for you all, this test flexible, most likely you're still gonna have to submit your SAT or ACT for a lot of these test flexible schools. So just something to keep in mind, that there might be other options out there for like the SAT subject tests are probably going to be the best way for you to suffice to really get these requirements done if you're not submitting the SAT or ACT test scores. And then there still are quite a few schools out there that do require, the traditional SAT or ACT test to be submitted. Even with COVID, there still are some schools that's kind of a really key factor in their admissions process, so they still are requiring them. So you definitely want to, once again, do your research and see what the requirements are for different schools that you're applying to. For schools that do require the SAT or ACT tests, it can really vary to how they're utilizing these tests in the admissions process. There are schools that we call holistic admission. That really means that they're trying to look at the whole picture of the students. Your test scores are just one piece to the whole puzzle. They're looking at your high school transcript, strength of curriculum. They're going to look at your extracurricular involvement, possibly essays, and letters of recommendation. A lot of times holistic admission means they're looking at all of those things. And your test scores, once again, are just one piece to all those other, factors that are coming into your application. Whereas there's other schools that are a little bit more, straightforward. They may be just utilizing a grid, and they look at your GPA and your test scores and they determine if you are admissible, or they have clear outlines of if you have a 3.0 GPA and this test score, then you're an automatic admit to X school. So you just want to be really aware of like what the admission requirements are for the schools you're applying to, and especially for schools that are requiring the SAT or ACT, how they're utilized in that process. For some schools, it's just going to be one piece to the puzzle. For others, it's going to be a bigger factor where they're really utilizing a grid or have really clear requirements on what, threshold they might look for with your test scores there. But I do encourage even juniors, I know with your testing, it's been a little crazy this year with SAT, ACT, do encourage you to take some tests if you can in the fall, if you haven't taken one already, to have those test scores on file for any schools that you might be applying to that are still requiring tests, or possibly, like I said earlier, wanting to still submit those for schools that are test optional, but you feel like you really think your test scores would help your overall application. And the SAT and ACT have, added some additional test dates for this upcoming year because of cancellations that they had to do in the spring. And they're looking at implementing at-home options for taking tests if students are in areas where schools are still closed and they can't go and actually test at a facility, then there are some other options for students there. So I definitely encourage you all to stay up to date on SAT and ACT websites and how they're, reacting to COVID-19, if there are any further cancellations that need to happen, or if they're able to, do at home for you if you're not able to take one in person. So those are definitely things to be aware of as we kind of move into this upcoming year. And I know there's a lot of kind of uncertainty around those tests and, if things are going to be able to happen, but they are, I think, doing their best to add dates and try to accommodate, especially with this current situation. I did want to just show kind of a grid of comparing the SAT, ACT. I think that's the other thing with, when you're deciding which one to take, and, thinking about, schools that you're going to have to submit the SAT or ACT for, thinking about whether or not you want to take the SAT or the ACT, because there are some slight differences between both of them. So this grid actually came from Princeton Review, kind of comparing the two tests and showing you what the differences are as far as the test structure, the length of the exam, what's offered for like the calculator policy and things like that. The one difference about the sections on the ACT is they have a science section, whereas you can see the SAT doesn't have any. So sometimes students do better on one type of test versus the other. So sometimes it can be helpful to take some practice exams for both the SAT and ACT to kind of see if there's one that you're kind of more inclined to do better based on the structure of it and the different sections that it covers. So that's something to keep in mind when you're deciding one test versus the other. And you can see the total that it scored out of. The ACT is 36 and the SAT is 1600. So you can get an idea kind of where your score kind of fits into that, especially looking at averages for schools that you're applying to, and kind of seeing where you fit in with their profile there. But definitely recommend, if you're taking the SAT or ACT, prep for it, because it's just like your sports you might be involved in or other things. The more you prep, the better you will do on those exams. So being able to just get familiar with how the exam is laid out, the timing for it, and the structure can be helpful for students. So just, I know it takes time and effort to prep for those types of exams, and isn't always the most fun way you want to spend your Saturday or whatever. But we do encourage students to prep for it, because you will perform better if you're able to get used to the structure and the questions and all of that. I did provide a few resources, especially as schools move to test optional policies. I know it might be overwhelming to think about, how do I even figure out which schools are test optional? Fair Test is a website that has a list of test optional schools, so I included that link for you to check out. The Princeton Review is one I mentioned that has some information on just basics of SAT, ACT, so you can look at that and see, kind of compare the tests and see which one you might want to take if you haven't decided yet. And then I linked to updates for, especially with COVID-19 and everything happening, linked to updates for the SAT and ACT, just to kind of see what the current policies are and things like that. If there are any future updates about their tests there, you can check out those pages as well. So I know that was a lot of information. Hopefully it wasn't too overwhelming for you all, but I do have some time for questions. I also included my contact information here. You're always welcome to reach out after today if you have questions. You know, we know the admissions process can be overwhelming, and especially those of us who have worked in admissions for a while, we really see ourselves as being there to help students through the process. And we know there can be questions you have just about admissions in general. So even though I work for a specific school, I'm always happy to answer just general questions about college admission, because I think a lot of us that are here in this profession are really passionate about it and want to make sure students get the best information they can. And so we are here to help. So any questions though about testing in general and admissions?
And you should have the ability to unmute yourself. Otherwise, you can also use the chat line, and we can respond to questions from there as well. Alrighty, let me see if I can. One is any hints on the college essay best practices if you're going to go test optional?
Yeah, so the college essay is, you know, a great opportunity to show us a little bit more about yourself that we can't see just through the other parts of your application. So, you know, when we're looking at your transcript and your extracurricular activities, once again, all these pieces are kind of telling a story. So the essay really should kind of add to that story. So I think where students really get kind of tripped up on the essay is really not sharing with us much about themselves. So sometimes the prompts for essays are asking about like a challenge that you overcame or a situation that really impacted you. Sometimes students end up talking more about the situation or the story than themselves. So even if something, you know, really significant happened in your life, if all we hear about is, let's say you moved several times throughout your high school career, and all you're talking about is where you moved to and why, and the different areas that you were in, but we don't really learn anything about you and how that impacted you or shaped you, then that's really not going to enhance your application, right? So I really encourage students when they're thinking about their college essay, really think about what is the reader going to take away about you after they've read this essay. If they can, you know, really learn something and get insight into your, experiences you've had, how they've shaped you, that's really what we're looking for. And so my best advice is to really be authentic and to really make sure that the essay at the end of the day is about you and that you're sharing with us information that's going to help us when we're looking at your application. So I hope that helps. I know this wasn't on essays specifically, but.
Oops. You know what? I think I took over the screen on accident.
Oh, that's all good. You can take over.
There's a question that says it's been some time between the testing process. I don't know if you want to go back to sharing your screen and showing the breakdown between the SAT and the ACT that you showed earlier.
Sure.
And then the follow-up part is any thoughts if a student should prioritize one over the other?
Yeah, I would really recommend I know it takes some time to do both, but do both practice exams and see if there's one that you kind of score better on, or the one that you feel like is a better representation of your academic abilities. Like I mentioned, they are structured a bit differently. At the end of the day, they both are standardized tests. I mean, you know, but there are some differences that might, you know, highlight an area that you're strong in, like science being an area on the ACT. If that's an area that you're really strong in, that might be a benefit to you to take that ACT exam. So I think the best thing to do is to start by just taking both as practice exams. Obviously don't do them both on the same day since they're both very long. Space them out, do both practice exams, see how you feel about the scores, and then that might, you know, decide which one you might want to do. There's also, you know, the PSAT, which, you know, some students on this call may have been a part of PSAT in their high school, but often, you know, there's days where that's a PSAT exam and the whole school possibly is taking that PSAT. That's a great opportunity to kind of see how the SAT is run and get an idea of your score on it. So definitely take part in those opportunities if you have the ability to, because it can really help you figure out which test might be a better one for you. So the PSAT is often done in the fall as a school-wide kind of opportunity, and then you can get an idea of what your score would be like on that, and then maybe take the ACT, practice test to see there as well. But I think it's just a good idea to look at both options and decide which one's the best for you. Most schools will take either one, and it's not like they have a preference on one versus the other. I think East Coast is a little bit more leaning towards the ACT, whereas the SAT is a little bit more prevalent on the West Coast, but either or, all schools that are requiring tests are going to look at either one. So it's not like you have schools have a preference most of the time there.
And Colleen, I'll piggyback a little bit.
Yeah, for sure.
At High Tech specifically, so our juniors take the PSAT in October. This year, our sophomores took it in February. For next year, it'll be freshmen and sophomores that will take it in February. And then obviously juniors always take it, the PSAT in October. And then we have a partnership with Revolution Prep where they do for $10 a practice SAT and practice ACT. And we do one of those in the fall and one of those in the spring that's open to sophomores and juniors.
Yeah, and I think you also mentioned Khan Academy in the chat. They also have some free prep too that's really helpful. So if you take, that's the other thing to keep in mind. If you take the practice exam and you don't score how you want to, there's tons of prep opportunities out there, especially now online, that are free. So definitely don't feel like that score, first of all, is totally speaking to who you are and your academic abilities. As I've talked about in this presentation, scores are not always the best predictors, but also you can have control over your scores by doing prep and really taking the time. Just like anything, the more time you put in, the more you're going to get familiar with it and the better you're going to perform on the exam. So you do have that option to kind of put in effort to raise your score. And, especially if you take a practice exam, there's opportunity to up it later on and when you take the real one.
All right, any other questions while we have Kalina captive? All righty, well, if not, thank you all for coming. Again, this recording will be posted on SCORE by Friday at the latest, as well as all the other previous College 411 videos. So thank you, Kalina. So,
yeah, of course.
Clap, everyone. And everybody have a good day. Stay safe, wash your hands.
I agree. Thank you all. Bye.
And I will stop the recording.